got it. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Joan, do you mind just starting by introducing yourself?
No, I'm Joan Kuyek, and I've been a community organizer for decades now. I live in Ottawa. I spent 65 to 70 in Kingston, where I was involved with the Kingston Community Project. And we did a whole lot of different things, including organize around housing. And since that time, I've continued to be an organizer, I guess. Although as I've got older, I tend to turn much more into a strategist and writer than I am a community organizer. It takes an awful lot of energy to be on the ground all the time.
I bet.
Yeah.
Well, for the band that I'm in, the Gertrudes, it was very exciting for us to stumble across Dennis Crossfield, the director
Yeah.
of the film Dear Landlord, that you were involved in. And it's so timely, Joan, just, what's happening in Boys Town and in our neighborhood, excuse me, uh, and where it was filmed like 50 years ago. Uh,
Yeah.
we're in a housing crisis now. You were in a housing crisis in 1969. Looking back on that film and that time in Kingston, how do you feel looking back at it? What's your perspective now?
Well, it's always interesting to look back like that because you realize what things have managed to change because people have been active and what things don't. And I guess I always see this as a power struggle. It's a power struggle between the forces that want to just treat us like commodities and take everything we have from us. As Joni Mitchell say, they pave paradise.
Mm.
And the rest of us who are trying to, live normal life, have good lives and care for one another and have a beautiful place to be. And that hasn't changed. But if we weren't struggling, it would have been a hell of a lot different. And so I can see some improvements, but certainly, and the nature of the struggle changes, but it's always there. And as soon as we start taking things for granted, they're going to take it away from us. So it's important to organize all the time. Um, and when I look at Kingston at that time and the sort of levels of, frankly, desperate poverty there was in the community, the housing, there wasn't as many people and there weren't as many apartment buildings, but the kinds of housing were appalling, right? Like people on Lower Union Street didn't even have indoor plumbing.
Mm.
So you start realizing that we did make a difference. And one of the things I know looking at it is that we actually managed with other tenants around the province to get the Landlord and Tenant Act amended. Um, Between the Law Reform Commission and the work we were all doing on the streets in Kingston and in other places, and the Ontario Tenants Association that ATAK organized, we got changes to the Landlord and Tenant Act in 1970 and rent control in 1975. I mean, granted, they don't look very good now, but compared to what it was before, when a landlord could just walk in, take everything you had, and throw you out, ask for a security deposit, paid no interest on it, you couldn't get it back. Um, it was much more feudal than it was, and I guess we brought it from feudalism to neoliberalism. I'm not quite sure what that really
That,
means, but we
that's
did.
amazing. That's some amazing achievements. And what we're experiencing now in Kingston, especially amidst a global pandemic, is, as you alluded to at that time, the way that people are suffering has become so much more visible. And the Gertrudes got involved in talking about the topic of housing and
Hmm.
people suffer from homelessness just because there was the encampment at Bell Park, and council was just experiencing a lot of pressure to deal with this problem that everyone was seeing. It wasn't hidden anymore.
Yeah.
And and so I'm experiencing it in my neighborhood. We're living in a gentrifying neighborhood. There's a lot of displacement as a result of the real estate, and people like me trying to figure out, to be blunt, like what to do with our privilege. And
Mm.
you organized a group called ATAK, and can you tell us more about ATAK and more about what you would suggest for people that are seeing problems and trying to figure out how to get involved and play a role?
Okay, well, the first thing I guess I need to say is that the Association for Tenants Action Kingston ATAK grew out of a number of years of organizing previously.
Yeah.
Um, the Kingston Community Project that Dennis and I were both part of um, really spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we could be most effective in organizing people for power, or poor people and people who were impoverished for power. And just before the attack got started, we had something called Community Information Services, which has now become the Queen's legal aid service.
Wow.
But it was basically run by working people who lived in the neighborhood, who helped other people who were running into problems, and it was incredibly successful. I mean, we had no money to pay anybody. There was some Queen's Law students who looked into whether the law could help us or not. Most cases, the law was no help at all in those days. But we would organize. We'd go down and demonstrate at the welfare office to get somebody back on welfare, or we'd be able to help somebody with workers' compensation claims, or, with their landlord. And we were getting increasingly numbers of people who were homeless or were being evicted or dealing with uh, horrible need for repairs in their apartment, and or overcrowding, which is, of course, the way any of us deal with a lack of housing. We just double up, triple up, quadruple up. There were people, families of 10 living in 2 bedrooms in some cases. So we had a whole base of people that we worked with all the time that had been organizing to support each other. There was a lot of collective action. And when we decided to focus on housing, on tenants' rights specifically, we realized that we were going to have to really mobilize. And we had a big meeting in 1968. There was a lot of people who came that we'd already worked with, students and generally low-income people, and some people from the NDP who were interested in seeing the NDP get more engaged at a local level. And we formed ATAK. We decided not to incorporate for all sorts of reasons. And we went ahead and basically launched a campaign to try and get the city to bring in rent control under the old Wartime Crisis and Trades Board Act. And we worked on all sorts of levels to do it. We had people like university profs who would help, and graduate students who helped try and organize around the law and getting a draft act written, and a housing subcommittee at city council. We ran people for council, and we got a petition with 5,000 signatures, which was pretty amazing in those days. But it meant we were out talking to people all the time. So in the film, you see some of the students going around and getting signatures on the petition.
Remember that?
And then in the midst of it, I got elected to city council. I was the alderman for St. Lawrence Ward. And at the same time, we had emergency shelter issues. A woman who was made homeless by a fire ended up living in the Bell Park bathhouse for a few weeks, until the landlord we were actually targeting gave her a place to live. We had demonstrations and stuff all over the city, and we just kept, and we got lots of press. In those days, we were able to get a lot of press. I think there was a story almost every day for a while about ATAK.
Mm.
Support from labor unions. We got support from various civil society organizations, from student groups, from the Alma Mater Society at Queens, for example. And every time we did it, that would get publicized. So the kind of grassroots daily organizing was amazing. And we were also helping people who were running into problems, because there was always some new big issue coming up. And so we were able to work with those people to try and solve their problems too. It was always a mutual effort. We weren't a service organization. We worked together to solve problems. And so the kind of mutuality and respect and building of community was really, really important.
I
And
love to hear. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I love to hear that, like what you're talking about, working together with many different groups all over the city, it sounded like, and the strength in that, and the skill sets, and
Yeah.
building capacity. And I'm just thinking of um, this opportunity in the neighborhood here, just up the hill from Boys Town at Providence Manor. And the Sisters of Providence are interested in repurposing that building. It's an entire city block. There's over 200 beds presently in there, and it seems to me there's this opportunity for this neighborhood to rally together to decide collectively what to do with it. Do you have
Well,
any
I
thoughts about that?
That's wonderful. I think that's a wonderful project. What I do know from other experiences of people trying to repurpose these old um, monuments to the church is that it's incredibly expensive to do it. Sometimes it's actually cheaper to tear it down and rebuild. And so that the whole question of whether it's worth trying to preserve a heritage building will become a challenge.
Well, they
And
have determined that it's feasible, and they
okay,
are going to keep it. It's just
okay,
a matter of, yeah, I think the who's going to pay for whatever it becomes, the
yeah.
affordable housing or supportive services or whatever. But yeah, I just, it's about to be a discussion in the neighborhood. And so it's just great to, Dennis lives right across the street. And so
I
we're
know.
going to be talking about it.
Yeah, maybe Sunday. I, I've been involved over the years now with a number of nonprofit housing projects, and so um, and other kinds of protests. I mean, we occupied a house in Sudbury in the early 1980s to try and get homes for homeless people. It was a CMHC house that was empty, and we occupied it, and the people there finally got housing.
Mm.
And in Sudbury too, we were able to get a whole lot of nonprofits built by exactly that kind of direct action. But the whole rebuilding of places is these days very challenging because government has basically backed out of the provision of low-income housing. I mean, there's a huge movement to try and improve that and to make it better, but it's very, very difficult. And so, if the Sisters of Providence are willing to do that, I think that's wonderful. It's going to cost a lot of money. And so the involvement of the people who might potentially live there in the planning and design of the thing becomes important. Recently, I was involved with a group of seniors who were trying to develop co-housing on a site where there was a heritage building that had been owned by the Oblates. And the saving of the facade of that building ended up making it almost impossible for anything to go ahead. And the price of land had gone up so much while we were doing it that none of us could afford to live in this thing we were designing. So we abandoned it. So part of the problem now trying to do those kind of things is the housing has been so financialized and land prices are so crazy right now that the square footage costs of doing any kind of development they're completely out of whack.
Mm.
I've always believed that housing is a public utility.
Yeah.
We should be able to provide housing for people as a function of my taxes. I'm a function of the state. And that people should be involved in planning and designing it and so on. But that it shouldn't, that the whole question of private property values and private ownership of a commodity that's so important to everybody is something we really need to challenge in a very profound way.
Yeah.
I mean, ATAK's motto was that there are two kinds of people interested in housing: those who live in it and those who live off it.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be both. I mean, I could rent out my basement and I become both. But it also means that I have different interests. I have interests in making some money off somebody else's need, and it becomes very complicated.
Yeah.
So I think the Providence Manor idea is great, but I'd be very, very wary of trying to preserve the heritage character of the building.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, for an awful lot of Indigenous people, those great big monuments to exploitation are not heritage at all. They should just be taken down and rebuilt. Most Indigenous people I know hate buildings that look like that and would
Yeah.
refuse to.
Yeah.
So that I think that needs to be challenged by
Mm-hmm.
some of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you raise some great points, Joan, and it's just so timely because our neighborhood is in this just very delicate time of transition, you know.
Yeah.
And you've probably seen from where you are the changes, and but I think there's opportunity too. I think people
Yeah.
are very concerned and eager to get involved and play a role. We have a municipal election coming up next year, and so yeah, I think the time is right for people to become more involved in this, which you are an inspiration for. So it was like I said at the beginning, it was such a treat to stumble across the film that you and Dennis were involved in, and just put it into perspective how this isn't a new problem, and but it's just as important as ever. And
Well,
just to hear your thoughts has been so helpful.
premising somebody's need for housing, or all our needs for shelter, on the same level of some developer's interest in making a profit seems to me to be pretty skewed in the first place. And so challenging municipalities in the province in the next year in the elections that are going to happen around these things is absolutely crucial. Going to
Yeah,
make any headway at all.
agreed. Well, it's been an honor to speak with you, and thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk
Well,
about this project.